In this slide, we're going to quickly review the most frequently encountered angles. We need to have those angles memorized for the practical purpose of exam taking, if we're in a phase of life when we're taking exams. It may also be a good technical skill to have in some particular areas of activity. For example, if you're generating mathematical graphics and you're programming them in PostScript, memorizing these angles comes in handy. So I'm personally using these angles myself for my work. But you do not need to have them memorized if you're not going to have an exam coming soon. However, if you are having an exam soon, please memorize these angles. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you quickly, I'm going to give you a certain amount of degrees, and I'm going to quickly ask you for corresponding radians. And once again, please, if you're going to be soon taking an exam, memorize those. So, 0 degrees in radians. I'm sure you guessed it correctly, 0 radians. 30 degrees in radians, pi over 6. I'm sure you guessed it correctly. 45 degrees in radians. Sure you guessed it correctly, pi over 4. 60 degrees in radians. Sure you guessed it correctly, a third of pi. 90 degrees in radians, that's this angle, that's the right angle, right? A right angle in radians, sure you guessed it correctly, that's half of pi. 120 degrees in radians, I'm sure you guessed it correctly, 2/3 of pi. 135 degrees in radians, that's this angle. 135 degrees in radians, I'm sure you guessed it correctly, 3/4 of pi. 150 degrees in radians, I'm sure you guessed it correctly, that's 5/6 of pi. 180 degrees in radians, pi, I'm sure you guessed it correctly. 270 degrees in radians, I'm sure you guessed it correctly, 3/2 of pi, or 1.5 times pi. And these may be also useful to memorize. 210 degrees is 7/6 of pi, 225 degrees is 5/4 of pi, and 240 degrees is 4/3 pi. 360 degrees, what's that equal to? I'm sure you know this, that's 2 pi. And once again, it may be useful to memorize these. 5/3 pi is 300 degrees, 7/4 pi is 315 degrees, and 11/6 pi is 330 degrees.